urban warfare, the world through Russia's eyes, and what do Russians think about the war in Ukraine? This is Military Matters. This episode is brought to you by Tekto Gear, TEKTOGEAR.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The Tekto Gear knives won't cost a half month's rent either. Today, Tekto Gear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TEKTOGEAR.com. Use the discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This is part 3 of our Future War series on Russia. If you're just now jumping in, no worries. You can start here and then go back and listen to the first and second part. As we've said before, the war in Ukraine has been developing faster than we can get these episodes out, but our focus remains in trying to paint a picture of the Russian military and its people. As of this recording, peace talks have been talked about, but with no real resolution. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed Congress asking for a no-fly zone, and at the least, the weapons to control it. Russian forces appear to be ramping up, while Moscow says they will be ramping down operations around Kiev. Foreign fighters have joined the fight via the Wagner Group, major cities pummeled, and the latest comments from President Biden referring to Russian President Vladimir Putin as a butcher have further inflamed Russia's sentiment against the West. In this episode, we'll be talking about the Russian view of the world, the impact of this war on the Russian people, and their concerns for the future of their country. But first, Jack Murphy takes us into the question of how was our assessment of Russia's military and tactics so wrong, their new fight in urban warfare, and whether or not Russia's view of the world even matters.
To take an initial look at Russia's military performance in Ukraine, I reached out to Dr. Rita Koneyev, who is the Associate Director of Analysis and a Research Fellow at the Center for Security and Emergent Technology, which is a think tank linked to Georgetown University. There, she has studied artificial intelligence and Russian military technology, and before that, urban warfare. In the interest of full disclosure, none of us really have authoritative data on the war in Ukraine as of yet, as it's a confusing and convoluted war zone. But Rita has the expertise to help us take a first look at what is happening and what conclusions we may be able to draw from the conflict. I was one of these people who I thought there's no way the Russian government is foolhardy enough to do this invasion. It doesn't make sense. When it did happen, I was like thinking, oh my God, the Ukrainian government has 48 to 72 hours until they get crushed and this war is over. That clearly did not happen. I mean, here we are basically a month later, and the Russians have taken maybe like a tenth of the country, if that, and the fighting has been pretty intense. The Ukrainian resistance persists. I was wondering if you could speak from this point of view. I mean, if you could explain to me, what did I get wrong? Why was I wrong?
So let's start by saying that you were absolutely not the only one who had that train of thought. I think that was actually probably the more conventional line of thinking. I think it was the most prominent line of thinking that was also kind of, strengthened and by trust and the popular view in the media and whatnot. The idea that an invasion would be too costly, that Putin would be too crazy to do something like this. What was interesting, though, is that line, for some reason, persevered, even though we started seeing these massive deployments to the border. And there were arguments that, this is an exercise, one was the exercise argument, the other one was this is just a show of force, this is just to, intimidate. But realistically speaking, by the time that he moved over 100,000 troops to the border, it was becoming increasingly difficult to argue that something was not going to happen. From that point, the conversation, I think, turned to what are the likely scenarios? What are they going to do? And if they were going to invade, I think the prominent point of view then became that they are going to have these limited goals where they're going to try to kind of retake eastern Ukraine and maybe try to do the bridge to Crimea to connect the south. And yes, there were a lot of people who were saying that this is a real mismatch because you have this massive Russian military that we've been tracking for the last decade and a half about or so that have been on this path to like modernization and has been implementing all of these reforms that have improved training, that have improved equipment, that they're like a global power when it comes to electronic warfare. Like I myself had conversations and had like interviews about that, especially the electronic warfare component, because people at the time were really talking about the Turkish-made drones and how they can help Ukraine. And I personally was like, but they're not going to do anything because Russia has integrated air defenses and they have like sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. And your Turkish-made drones can work against like a much more inferior, unsophisticated opponent. But this is a real military here, and it's going to make real moves and have like real defense capabilities. And clearly that was not the case. But I will say that the minute that it looked like they were going to invade, I personally looked at the map of Ukraine, and there was no argument that if they do have these maximalist war goals, they're going to have to fight in cities. And the minute that you have an urban warfare component, let alone several of them across an entire country, you are not going to have a quick victory. I don't care what kind of sophisticated advanced military you are, you will get bogged down. Urban warfare is a war of attrition. So of all the, several mistakes that we've all made along the way, I think the one that we are continuously making is the idea that this is about to end soon, one way or another.
When we saw the invasion kick off, and again, this is looking from a very perhaps American perspective. I mean, my thought the thought would be, well, they're going to start off with a shock and awe. There's going to be pre-assault fires, knocking out anti-aircraft systems and establishing air superiority. You'd have Spetsnaz units, or we did see VDV try to capture the airfield. You're going to have this sort of what we would call sort of like operational preparation or shaping the battle space before the main force goes in there. And we didn't really see that. I mean, what we did see was rather anemic, with convoys kind of held up on the streets, tanks just running out of gas. It was, I mean, one fighter on the ground described it to me. It was like they'd send some Russians to fight us, and then they get repelled, and they'd send a little bit more the next day, and they get repelled, and then a little bit more. It was like not a cohesive invasion by any stretch of the imagination. It was like units being sent across the border in a sort of haphazard manner. From your perspective, I mean, what do you think was happening there? Why do you think the invasion happened in those initial few days the way that they did?
No, it's a really good question. And I think it's on all of our minds, especially the people that have been watching the Russian military for a long time and witnessing this military fight. It's a very different story, because on paper, everything that you described should have been happening. And in reality, we're definitely not there. I think that it was lack of preparation because there is a political issue here. I think they were fundamentally not prepared to actually fight. I think they were expecting that the numbers themselves, this massive presence, is going to be a sufficient enough of a deterrent for any sort of Ukrainian resistance. And if they were actually going to need to invade and progress, the numbers in combination with their assessment of how weak the Ukrainians must be is just going to be an open path to Kiev and to all of their maximalist strategic goals. So I think they were fundamentally not prepared for any sort of real resistance at a logistics level, at a technological level, at an air support level, at the sustainment for a longer campaign level, but even more so on like a psychological morale level. And, you know, the more I look at it, and I was thinking about it a while ago, because I wrote about the Russian-Chechen conflict a little bit for my dissertation. And so many of the pathologies for the first Chechen war, the calculations before the invasion, the initial phase of the invasion, like especially that division of the forces across the three lines, the slow progress towards the urban areas, the struggle to even get into the urban areas, and just this like shocking level of misunderstanding and underestimating your enemy is really mirror image in many ways.
I think also the question I wanted to ask was what happened between 2014 and 2022? Because in 2014, what we did see were some rather tight, efficient Russian military operations in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. The little green men tearing the Russian flag off the uniform and doing this invasion, and the entire Western world was kind of like flabbergasted. And we were the ones our response was anemic at the time. We were the ones caught flat-footed by that, and it just happened, and there was like nothing we could do about it, it seemed. Now here we are in 2022, and it's you could ask the question, what changed within us and our policy and our military posture? And obviously NATO and the United States was in Ukraine preparing their military in the interim. But also that question of what happened to the Russian government and the Russian military during that interim that we're seeing such a stark difference in how they're performing.
Yeah, that's a question you can tackle from like 15 different directions, which makes it good, but also like reflects the complexity of the situation. So one thing that's important, I think, to understand in order to understand what happened is that was a gray zone hybrid conflict, which we convinced ourselves
the future of modern warfare.
Yeah, the future of modern warfare, right? So, like I said, I work on military AI. So until a couple of weeks ago, until this started, most of the conversations we've been having in these rooms about the future of war is that it's digital, is that it's all in the information space, that cyber is going to play like almost a decisive role, that you're going to see increasingly more operations although we weren't admitting it because we were preparing for like some sort of a conventional, not competition or confrontation with China. But the idea is probably because there's nuclear weapons involved, there's still a lot going to play out in that like sub-level non-armed conflict, not high-level conflict arena. And we just haven't really thought about conventional war for a long time. And apparently neither did Russia, because they fought a very brief but still conventional war in Georgia in 2008, and they did terribly there, which prompted a lot of the reforms that they've implemented. And then we've seen like the fruits of those reforms in their operations in Syria and then in Ukraine, where they had this like tactical innovation and they looked really good and organized and cohesive, and not like the military we're seeing today. So part of that is the conventional element and the urban element, but also, of course, the Ukrainians have improved monumentally. I would also add that this right now for Ukraine feels like an existential fight. And that was not in 2014. Crimea was taken peacefully, and I'm doing air quotes here because obviously it was illegal and it's an annexation that is not recognized by international law. Eastern Ukraine, Donbass, and the Donbass area was not taken peacefully, but it was still in that, the type of conflicts that we've seen and fit into this framework that we had about insurgency. It was difficult to understand who is who. Um, so it was within the realm of possible. And what Ukraine is facing right now seems like an existential threat. And I think the response from the West is kind of according to that. So I had a conversation about kind of public opinion in Southeast Asia. So like India, Pakistan, not even mentioning China, but countries that have, let's say, a complicated relationship with the United States and a complicated view about US foreign policy. The Russian perspective there is not uncommon. And there's a lot of like, I don't know if to say sympathy, but maybe perhaps more of an understanding of the Russian argument that, you know, US-led NATO expansionism is a threat to us, and we have the right to protect ourselves. So the world is unified to an extent in favor of Ukraine, but for the most part, it is the Western world.
I mean, I know somebody's probably going to jump in and accuse me of having some sort of racist. I'm not in tune with the global South when I say this, but I mean, do their voices matter? That this war is happening in Europe, in the Western world, yeah. And I understand that the Russians, of course, want to put together their own version of a coalition of the willing. Does it matter if Mongolia and Zimbabwe are aligned with Russia on this?
It might not matter for those, but it does matter where China stands, for sure. Mm-hmm. It absolutely it matters where India stands. It matters where we're also talking about economies and population sizes. You know, Pakistan might not be the most significant foreign policy actor, but it's a country that retains economic ties with Russia. India is a democracy. It's the largest democracy in the world. Their opinion matters. So for the immediate implementation of like sanctions and military support and response, of course, there's no argument that this is the significance is European and US and Canada, and Australia and whatnot. But the rest of the world is at play when it's going to come to the economic pressures. And it's also going to matter when we're going to start talking about, like when we're going to start talking about justice and persecution of war crimes in international bodies where different types of countries get a say. So the ability to kind of present a cohesive global counter-Russian coalition might not matter immediately right now, but will play out later.
So as far as this plays out in the medium and long term, you mentioned that this thing isn't going away anytime soon, that it looks like we may be in for a long haul, that the Russians are going to get bogged down in these urban population centers. I mean, I don't want to get involved in making predictions or rubbing crystal balls, but where do you think what are some like plausible scenarios that you think could play out in the coming months and maybe even years as this thing stretches on?
I don't know, looking at this right now, I think that it's going to be a bit of a slow, dragged on, not lower level from a civilian perspective, but continuous war of attrition around some of the key cities. I think Russia takes Mariupol, I think, and bombards it to take it, with all the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding there, only exacerbated. I think it then makes a push to do some of that, perhaps at a slightly lower level around Kiev, and within the next month continues negotiating to some sort of a ceasefire that effectively partitions the country. I don't think they're going to be occupying anything, because I think the displacement is going to make it effectively easier for them to retain certain parts of the country that they hold closer throughout the South and the Southeast, adding to the East that they already hold.
So you think they really will do a sort of reenactment of Aleppo or Homs and just leveling?
They're doing it in Mariupol, where everything that they're saying right now, like the language is effectively the same. This is where I get like really agitated, because I keep hearing like Ukraine is not Syria, Ukraine is not Chechnya. Well, Mariupol right now is an example of how it is, because they're gonna bombard whatever's left of that city. They've already given the ultimatum of like leave, or we assume you are, enemy combatants, while also not letting people leave. And the language is very similar to how they approached Aleppo, and they are at a point where they have to take it, because otherwise their entire southern campaign which is the only somewhat, not, I can't call it successful, but less failing effort, is throughout the South and the Southeast. So I do think that they take it that way, and they either negotiate from there, or they do another push towards Kiev to, level, kind of strengthen their position at negotiations to get more of what they want.
So as some of it is quite open and overt, some of it not, but as we funnel military aid to Ukraine, it seems like we're pushing everything into theater that we can, just short of having a direct military confrontation with the Russians, but sending Stinger anti-aircraft systems, Javelin anti-tank systems. Is it possible to fight Russia down to whittle them down through attrition? And I mean, you'd have to look at, reaching a stalemate versus actually repelling them. But from that standpoint, as far as our military assistance, what do you see as like some realistic outcomes there?
No, it is possible to get them to a point of attrition, but attrition, attrits, or whatever the word is, it works on both ends, right? And it doesn't look like the Russian military forces are bringing new resupplies and new personnel into the theater. But they might. And on the Ukrainian side, that force is finite. Like, they're already drawing on civilians for support. And the more people are displaced from the city, the more people die from the bombardments. That force, it's great that it's continuing to be supported through military hardware and other sort of military assistance, but the number of the people manning that equipment is finite. So attrition works on both ends. And the other thing is that this leveling of the playing field, with the fact that Russia is performing terribly, plus the fact that the Ukrainian military and support units are performing amazingly well, plus the urban warfare, which favors the defense, plus the support from the international community, the military support, that equalization protracts the stalemate, and protracts the conflict. So I don't really agree with the perspectives that say that attrition is going to favor Ukraine. Perhaps, yes, but the question is at what price, at what cost? What is left to protect? What is left to defend of Ukraine after as this attrition progresses?
Before we started, you mentioned to me that one of your fears is that we're learning the wrong lessons from this conflict. And I wanted to ask you, what you meant by that, what you think we should be taking away from it. Because when I look at this conflict, one of the things that I seriously have to ask myself is, does America really have a peer or near peer adversary, or has all of that been cynical propaganda at worst? that no one can touch us militarily, that no one can kind of plan and execute complicated modern military operations the way America does. I have my questions about whether or not China can compete militarily with us. But when we focus on Russia, I mean, do you think that it's possible we're deriving some of the wrong lessons from what we're seeing unfold in Ukraine?
Yes, I think we're deriving a bunch of wrong lessons, especially about our own invincibility, which I think is profoundly dangerous. And we've done that so many times and been proven wrong on that regard, on that account, that you would hope that we would learn from that. You know, now, again, the Russian military, we probably overestimated their capabilities. There's no argument. And they're clearly underperforming even below that threshold of our lowest estimates of how capable they are. And they're making unexplainable mistakes all throughout. But if you walk through the library stacks on Iraq and US operations in Iraq, you will see book titles like Folly and Hubris and What Went Wrong and No Entry Without Exit Strategy. So at a certain point, we've engaged in some sort of self-reflection about the mistakes that we make. And yet here we are, looking at another army, making fundamental mistakes, critical mistakes. And we're sitting there thinking, this is just a Russian problem, and this would never happen to us.
Well, I think the difference, though, is like we're not good at counterinsurgency. I mean, I don't think anyone's really good at counterinsurgency, but we're definitely not good at it. But as far as conventional fighting, I mean, we crushed the Iraqi army. I mean, we went in there and crushed the Taliban and took over the country. Like, that wasn't the problem. The problem was governing civilian populations that don't want us there.
I don't think there's going to be a purely conventional confrontation in any sort of a conflict that you are interested in preserving the laws of war. Mm-hmm. And any sort of a conflict where you are still operating under assumption that this is a population that deserves to live in a democracy, and we're not here to, just level their entire country from the air. Because we can do that. But if that's the conventional war we want to fight, which are not the scenarios they're discussing, I don't think there's ever going to be the type of purely conventional confrontation. We're also, the United States is, by virtue of its geography, still very much insulated from the costs of war. So the United States military can make mistakes at an insurgency or counterinsurgency or even at a conventional level without the American population paying the type of a price that it would if the United States was located elsewhere. So there is also kind of that buffer there. But my point is that we are learning right now that we overestimated the Russian capabilities, which is true, which we should look inward and try to assess why we did that. But we're also concluding that this is a Russian problem, this inability to fight effectively. And that's true to an extent. But we also know that throughout history, whenever there's an urban warfare component in a fight, there hasn't been a single military that hasn't been humbled by fighting in cities or near cities or trying to take a city. And with urbanization trends across the world and with the majority of population of the world living in cities, that is the future of the fight. And that is a fight that the United States is still not very prepared for. If anything, in a lot of the conversations that were being had in this part of like the strategic competition and how you design the military to fit our goals, in the strategic competition with China, urban warfare once again took the back seat because it's interlinked and associated with some sort of counterinsurgency operations. And we're seeing right now that's not true. It plays a critical role in conventional conflict as well. So to me, that is the lesson that is one of the lessons that we should be learning, is that the future of war is in cities, and we need to learn how to fight in them without leveling them.
Ideal for fishing, especially if one needs to quickly cut a line, the Romeo folding knife comes with a light carbon fiber handle with an amazing grip and a D2 steel blade. Fair warning, the blade is extremely sharp and cuts through the toughest materials. What makes it simple is the flipper tab. The knife pops open for quick use, all in one single motion. Go to tektogear.com today. Tecto Gear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase.
I actually think that to really understand what's going on, you have to begin with the domestic. That is one element of the story that we're not hearing enough about.
To help us understand what's happening in Russia to the Russian people, I turned to Dr. Golfo Alexopoulos.
My name is Golfo Alexopoulos. I'm a professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at the University of South Florida in Tampa Bay. I'm also director of the USF Institute on Russia, which was founded in 2017 to enhance knowledge and understanding of Russia and the broader region. And I feel like you really can't understand contemporary Russia without having a good grounding in the past, especially in the Soviet past, because the current leaders in Russia had their formative years in the Soviet era, especially Vladimir Putin.
So tell me, as you were watching, I'm sure with the rest of the world, as Russia was poised along the borders, a lot of American analysts, a lot of military analysts really didn't think the Russians were going to cross that border. What was your impression when they actually did cross the borders and began what we are, for all intents and purposes, calling an invasion?
So I actually was in a minority of people who thought that Putin would invade. And the reason I thought that, first of all, let me talk about why so many people, the vast majority, thought he would not. There was a lot of evidence to suggest that he wouldn't do it, because Putin in the past has been very cautious and circumspect in Syria. He used air power. He didn't send in his own troops. He was very concerned about body bags and how that Russian public opinion surrounding a larger war. When he annexed Crimea, he did so with the unmarked little green men, and then had that referendum. So he seems to move, in the past, he has moved rather cautiously and incrementally. Even when he moved into eastern Ukraine, he didn't, launch an all-out invasion of Ukraine. In fact, many people who thought that he might go in believed he would limit himself to eastern Ukraine. And indeed, when he had that meeting with his Security Council just prior to the invasion, he had each of them validate the decision to go into eastern Ukraine, to liberate eastern Ukraine, recognize eastern Ukraine as independent. So there was a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a guy who's really pragmatic and cautious and doesn't do rash and bold things. So Putin is now, this is a guy who's been in power for over 20 years. His popularity has definitely declined. He's concerned about maintaining his power. He went as far as to poison Alexei Navalny, which is not unusual for him.
Dr. Alexopoulos is talking about Alexei Navalny. Navalny is a Russian lawyer and Russian opposition leader who's led anti-government demonstrations and publicly spoken out against Russian President Vladimir Putin. Back in 2020, Navalny made headlines when he fell ill due to nerve agent poisoning, which many, including Navalny, suspect was tied to the Kremlin. He survived the ordeal, but was sentenced to prison by Russian authorities for violating the terms of his parole, stemming from suspended sentences related to embezzlement charges, which Navalny also claims are retaliation for his political activism.
He has poisoned opponents with, nuclear isotopes and chemical weapons and shot opponents and so on. So this is a brutal man who wants to stay in power. And I think that because of the fact that domestically he started to experience challenges that he had never experienced before, and then coupled with the pandemic, which analysts believe made him even more isolated. I think that this made Putin become more bold and more willing to take risks. But there's more. I think that the main reason why the main evidence that he was going to go into Ukraine were his speeches, were his own language, his own speeches, his own statements. For the last year, we have seen a real uptick in his obsession with Ukraine. In July, he wrote this treatise about history and how Ukraine is really his historic Russian lands. He's been obsessed with this for a long time. He even told George W. Bush when George W. Bush was president, I think it was in 2006, that Ukraine, it's not a real country. So Vladimir Putin has been obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, obsessed with Russia's sphere of influence, and more than any other former Soviet republic, he has been obsessed with Ukraine. And this has come out a lot in the past year through speeches, through dismissals of Ukrainian statehood. And because Zelensky had been pivoting more to the West, this caused alarm in Putin that, God forbid Ukraine if it becomes a successful democracy, it would offer Russians evidence of how they too could build a successful democracy. So there were threats that Putin saw, both domestically and in Ukraine, and then couple that with his sense of insecurity, that he's an aging leader who's been in power for so long that his own people are getting sick of him, and his mythological pseudo-historical vision of how Ukraine really should be part of Russia.
Take us into Russia, if you can, with all of the cameras and all of the media and all this information. How much of that has made it into to the Russian public view? We've seen some videos of protests, but I'm very cautious about making assessments based on the very little that I've seen come out of Russia itself.
It's true. We do have to be cautious because in an authoritarian regime where opposition is punished so severely, it's really hard to get at what people really think, and they often will not share their true views with pollsters. There's a very good independent polling agency, the Levada Center. That's the one that we should trust the most. But you'll notice that even with Levada Center polls, if they ask people, how do you feel about the war? Are you in favor? Are you opposed? There might be a slight majority in favor and then a small segment opposed, but then there's a huge number of people who have no opinion. So you see that a lot, no opinion. Or do you support Vladimir Putin? There'll be a slight majority that says yes, huge group that has no opinion. And then, of course they have an opinion, about their president, but they won't share it with a pollster. So if we try to gather from the evidence that we have so far, the Kremlin controls information in Russia and has tried increasingly, if there's one kind of constant thread through the Putin years, it has been the desire to control information to a greater and greater degree. The major TV stations, that broadcast across the 11 time zones of Russia, though that is state TV, that is a single Kremlin approved message. You cannot call this a war. You cannot call this an invasion. You have to call it a special military operation. And they really talk about the Donbass region. They really talk about the eastern Ukraine. Ordinary Russians who are watching television have no idea that there's been a full-scale assault on most Ukrainian territory. So they don't know that. Young people who are more savvy do get their news from independent TV. There's an excellent I have to use the past tense, unfortunately, now, because just in the past week, the most prominent independent radio station, Echo Moskvy, which also has a station in St. Petersburg, that was forced it was forced off the air. They now just issue like YouTube videos. TV Rain, it's an excellent television station that focuses on news. I was watching them continuously from the time the war began. They have been forced off. So it's just heartbreaking. And the reason why this independent media has been forced off is that the Kremlin came out with this new law that said, if you show any footage that is not approved, if you make a statement that is not approved, if you use the word war or invasion that's not approved, then you run the risk of serving up to 15 years in prison. And so they just didn't take the risk, and they refused to play ball with the Kremlin under those circumstances. So how are Russians getting their news now? I think that young people are using VPNs to circumvent some of the firewall that the Kremlin is instituting. I think the Kremlin is trying so hard to control information. But I think you're right that in a modern society that is saturated with cell phones, and a lot of intelligent people who know how to get past firewalls, I think that message is coming out. But it will take some time. It will definitely take time for family in Ukraine to reach out to friends and family in Russia, and for people to share personal messages and so on. I think it will take time. My general sense, though, is that if you told the Russian public that their government is bombing innocent civilians, they would be overwhelmingly opposed. So I think Putin is afraid of the truth getting out to Russian citizens. Ordinary Russian citizens are opposed to war, and they would never approve of this. So if they're giving pollsters their approval of war in Ukraine, they're really speaking to all the hype about Eastern Ukraine. The actual facts on the ground have been hidden from them.
Can you tell me about the relationship between Russia and the Ukrainian people?
It's so interesting because the polls before the war began, they were unequivocal. They showed unequivocally that ordinary Russians did not view Ukrainians as enemies, and they didn't view the Ukrainian state as illegitimate. So broadly speaking, Russians acknowledge that there is an independent state called Ukraine that has a right to exist. That view is not shared in the Kremlin among Putin and his extremist nationalist inner circle. So for ordinary Russians, Russians and Ukrainians intermarry. They have friends, in each other's country. I mean, they're very close, actually, as a people. They are very close. And when there was a Soviet Union, the different groups within the Soviet Union interacted by and large very peacefully. Now, it's also important to state that Ukraine, as a territory, was fighting for its independence for a long time. It was absorbed into the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Before that, it was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. And when it was absorbed into the Russian Empire, it constituted an entity that was a colonial entity, just like all the great empires of Europe. So in World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, the Russian Empire did not collapse in the same way. It had a Bolshevik revolution and a civil war. The people of Ukraine fought for their independence in that period from, say, 1918 to 1922. But they were not successful. They remained part of the newly constituted Russian Empire, as now the Soviet Union. The borders of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union more or less coincided. And then the Bolsheviks kind of carved out these ethno-territorial entities, and Ukraine was one of them. So the Ukrainian people were part of the Bolshevik or communist project. Ukrainians served in the Politburo and in different areas of government. But it's important to note, too, that under Stalin, there was a brutal assault against national sentiment in Ukraine. So there was a terrible famine in 1932-33. Many people died, Russians, Kazakhs, Ukrainians, but the ground zero for that famine was really Ukraine, and historians believe that Stalin was especially brutal towards Ukraine because he wanted to crush Ukrainian nationalism. And then during World War II, the Bolsheviks, or the Communist Party, fought an insurgency within Ukraine, fighting for their independence at the end of World War II. Many Ukrainian nationalist fighters continued to fight the Soviet state into the 40s. So there's always been a resistance. And by the way, this is why I don't think it should have surprised anyone that there's been such a fierce resistance to the Russian invasion by the Ukrainians. So Ukrainians and Russians, they have a shared history. The first Russian state was centered in Kiev. That was Kievan Rus, as it's called. So they have a shared history for sure. For sure, they have a shared history. They also have a painful history together. They also have a period of history in which was not shared. So it's complicated, but I think on a citizen to citizen level, they're quite close.
Can you describe to me a little bit about how plugged in you are to the current state of some of the Russians that are inside of Russia right now who may not be exposed to the full messaging? Are you in contact with anybody there?
Yeah, so I'll be pretty vague if I can, just because I'm concerned about friends. And I do know of I know people who are immersed in the Kremlin's line about this war, and I'm not going to jeopardize them by. I am afraid about how repressive this regime is and how viciously it's going against people who protest the war or speak out against the war. So I am nervous about that. I also I also know people who have tried to flee They're concerned about their safety and the safety of their loved ones. I think I read in the paper that over 200,000 Russians have tried to flee. Many of them are going to Europe, to the Caucasus, to Kazakhstan. So I am hearing this. I think that there are Russians who are in a bubble and immersed in the Kremlin's propaganda concerning the war, and simply don't know the truth about what's really happening, how much this war is terrorizing ordinary civilians. This regime, just in the past year, has done things that we would never have expected. I mean, they closed down Memorial, which was a very prominent human rights organization in Russia. They've initiated a full frontal assault on independent media. It's hard to call Russia a democracy. It was hard even a few years ago. Now it is just full-on authoritarianism.
You mentioned that if the Russian people really knew the truth of what was happening, that they would be opposed to this.
I really believe that. I really, really believe that. I've spent a lot of time in Russia. I have Russian friends. I don't see how ordinary Russians, if they just get the news, and that's why I really do think the United States needs to work really hard to get to penetrate that firewall and that monopoly on information that the Kremlin has. I think that if the word gets out, you'll always have that group, just like you always have the little group of Stalinists in Russia. They're a very small minority. The vast majority of Russians want a free, democratic country that they can be proud of, and has many allies and is well respected in the global community and not a pariah.
Well, one of the messages that Putin has put out is this very anti-West ideology that we are a problem, and that the idea is that the Russian people are on board with this, that they are also anti-West, that they see this this issue that if they knew the Russian military was having such a difficult time in the Ukraine, that they would blame the West. They would say this is the Americans, this is the Western powers not allowing us, i.e. the Russian people, to liberate the Ukrainians from this Nazi regime. How does that message, is that a accurate message? Is that an accurate portrayal of Russian sentiment?
You're right that there were these polls that were conducted prior to the invasion where they asked Russians who's responsible for this crisis. And Russians did not blame Putin. They didn't blame Russia. They blamed the West and NATO. So you're absolutely right that the anti-Western drumbeat that ordinary Russians get has made headway. It's definitely resonated with a lot of Russians, and it has been embraced by a lot of Russians. It's also true that the Kremlin does, when the Kremlin says that NATO is trying to come up to the border of Russia and it threatens Russia, and when the Kremlin says that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrate the expansionist, aggressive nature of the American government and the West, I mean, when they, that ordinary Russians just buy it. They'll buy that position. They don't study geopolitics, and if this is what their government is telling them, they're largely going to believe it.
When we think about the current state of Russia, we can't ignore the overwhelming economic collapse that we're seeing unravel. The ruble has dropped. It's just been plunging. Russian banks are offering 50% interest for just keeping your money in the banks. and foreign sanctions, along with private corporations such as Apple and Google saying we're not going to let them use our Apple Google Pay. I mean, it's even to the point where Netflix and Warner Brothers are saying no movies, no television for you.
Right.
How does this affect the Russian people? Are they feeling like they're taking an unfair punishment?
That is a really interesting question. I was listening to an interview by the very famous Russian economist Sergei Guriev, who he's now in France, but he was head of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and he also worked very high up in the presidential administration of Dmitry Medvedev between 2008 and 2012. And then he fled the country, actually. He left. He was worried when Putin came back to power that he might suffer some repression under Putin in Putin's third term. But Guriev has talked about this, and he made the point that the decisions by these companies to move out of Russia will probably have a greater impact or as great an impact on ordinary citizens as, the sanctions on the Russian central bank. Because when Visa breaks off its ties with Russia, and ordinary Russians can't use their Visa card if they want to flee the country or if they need help or whatever. I mean, that's almost going to help Putin control the society even more. And this is what I really worry about, because if it gets harder for people to use a smartphone, if it gets harder for people to access their money, they're going to be completely subject to state power. They're going to have no way of accessing information outside of the state media bubble. They won't have a way to flee, to survive. So I do worry. I worry that these sanctions are punishing ordinary Russians too much. I was absolutely in favor of the sanctions against oligarchs. And in fact, I think, if we look at what Alexei Navalny, the main opposition leader to Putin, who is now in prison, if we look at what his organization had suggested and other pro-democracy activists in Russia had suggested, they didn't talk about these kind of full-scale sanctions, in years past. They just wanted the West to stop helping oligarchs hide their money, stop the kleptocracy, stop the money laundering, stop, Abramovich from buying Chelsea, or, all these guys from buying yachts and villas in Italy and apartments in London. They wanted really severe sanctions on Putin and his entourage. And they would come up with a list of like 30 people, including propagandists and oligarchs and so on. And they wanted it to extend to wives, mistresses, family members, children, grandchildren. Like, that's what they called for, because they knew that that's getting at the head of the beast without punishing ordinary Russians. What we're seeing now with the ruble collapse and all these companies pulling out, economists talking about the country defaulting, that's really going to affect ordinary Russians, and how they will view this, whether they'll blame the West or blame Putin, or it's really an open question.
As we wrapped up our conversation, I wanted to know if Dr. Alexopoulos thought there was a way for this conflict to end where perhaps Putin could save face and enjoy the same level of authority and security in his position he enjoyed before the Ukraine invasion.
I don't think Putin can, because he's so, he's not going, I just don't see, like, how does he come up with a face-saving exit Like, what is a face-saving exit for Putin? I just don't see it, because it's been such a horrible disaster so far. So I think he's just going to dig in his heels, become more and more brutal. And that's what worries me the most, that there's going to be some nuclear disaster, or there's going to be some other, environmental catastrophe that draws in more countries. So I do worry, because Putin is not behaving in a rational way right now. I mean, the fact that he even initiated this war reveals that he's living in a bubble. So it's just hard to know. To me, in my view is that it doesn't end unless Putin falls. But keeping him in there, I don't see how it ends with Putin still in power.
The war continues in Ukraine with some new headway towards peace, but nothing that indicates the war will end anytime soon. The Russian economy is in dire straits, and despite all the numbers thrown around regarding money and cost, there are real lives at stake and real lives that have been lost. The fear in everyone's mind is an escalation toward world war with repercussions that we really can't imagine. When Jack and I first envisioned this story on Russia, there was no war. We both had our ideas of what the Russian military was and wasn't, and how an engagement like the one we see today would have gone. We were both wrong, along with so many others. The few that did call it right don't seem to have a very positive prediction for the future, so in that respect, I hope they're wrong. The war in Ukraine also has had ripple effects throughout the world, such as its effect on cryptocurrency, gas prices, and soon the experts warn the world will feel the grip of hunger as Russia's wheat supply comes into question. We'll be back next week with another Fast Take. Don't forget to go to stripes.com and use promo code podcast to get 50% off your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes. That's stripes.com. Use promo code podcast to get 50% off your digital subscription. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
We'll see you at the next episode. This episode is brought to you by TektoGear, TektoGear.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The TektoGear knives won't cost you half a month's rent either. Today, TektoGear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TektoGear.com. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to TektoGear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase.